The morning of June 14, 2008, began like any other on the sprawling 400-acre Caldwell Ranch in West Texas. The land stretched endlessly beneath a sky already beginning to shimmer with the early heat of summer. Henry Caldwell, a 56-year-old third-generation rancher with sun-baked skin and calloused hands, stood on his porch sipping black coffee from a chipped enamel mug. He watched the horizon with a practiced eye, noting the low movement of cattle near the southern fence line. His wife, Margaret, called to him from the kitchen window, reminding him about lunch and warning him to ride carefully. It was going to be another scorcher. He smiled at her, gave a small salute with his mug, and turned toward the stables. His horse, a chestnut gelding named Buck, was already saddled by the time Henry reached the barn. It was a routine ride: check the perimeter fencing near the dry gulch, see that the cattle hadn't broken through again, and maybe swing by the old windmill to test the water flow. Henry was known for being thorough, the kind of man who didn't mind solitude as long as he had a horse under him and wide open sky above. He didn't carry a cell phone, preferring the old CB radio in his saddlebag, though it rarely picked up a signal this far out. He mounted up, tipped his hat toward Margaret one last time, and rode off down the narrow dirt trail that wound through mesquite and scrub. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, baking the land into waves of golden heat. Around noon, Margaret made lunch and left a plate for Henry on the porch table as she always did. By mid-afternoon, she began to feel uneasy. Henry had never been one to linger without reason, especially not in the heat. Still, she told herself he was likely working on a stubborn fence post or trailing a stray calf. By 6 p.m., with the sun dipping low and no sign of him, Margaret's unease hardened into panic. She called the neighbors, old friends who lived a mile down the road, and together they rode out into the dusk calling Henry's name. They followed the faint trail his horse had taken, spotting hoofprints in patches of soft dirt, but they vanished near the creek bed, as if the desert had swallowed them. They searched until the stars came out, then again at first light, joined now by sheriff's deputies and local volunteers. Helicopters were called in, drones were deployed, even dogs were brought in from neighboring counties to track his scent. Still, no trace. All they found was Henry's weather-worn cowboy hat, caught on the thorny branch of a mesquite bush near the southern edge of the property. It looked untouched by wind or time, as if someone had carefully placed it there. It sent a chill down Margaret's spine. She clutched it tightly when the sheriff handed it to her, tears threatening to fall. Days turned into weeks. The media picked up the story: Texas rancher vanishes without a trace. Reporters rolled in with their vans and cameras, but when no new developments emerged, they moved on. The case became one of many unsolved disappearances in the harsh and unrelenting Texas desert. Margaret, though heartbroken, refused to give up. She kept Henry's name alive, visiting the sheriff's office weekly and demanding updates. But eventually, even the most dedicated investigators had to admit the truth: there was no trail to follow. Rumors began to spread. Some believed Henry had suffered a stroke or heart attack and died out on the range, his body buried beneath shifting sands or dragged off by coyotes. Others whispered darker possibilities: maybe he'd run afoul of someone, or uncovered something he shouldn't have. There had been tension in the region lately, disputes over water rights and boundary lines. More than a few neighbors had argued with Henry in the months before his disappearance. But without evidence, it all remained speculation. Margaret hung a new gate at the ranch entrance, nailing up a wooden sign that read, "Caldwell Ranch, in loving memory of Henry." She kept the land going as best she could, refusing to sell or let it fall into ruin, convinced that someday, somehow, she'd learn the truth. The desert, silent and wide, held its secrets tight. The search for Henry Caldwell went on for nearly 3 weeks before the official efforts began to slow. By the end of the first month, most of the volunteers had returned to their farms, their businesses, their daily lives. The sheriff's department, stretched thin and under pressure from newer emergencies, gradually shifted the Caldwell case from active search to open investigation. For Margaret, however, time didn't move the same way. Every day that passed without answers was a wound that refused to close. The land didn't forget either. The stretch of terrain where Henry's trail ended, the dry gulch, the mesquite thicket, the shallow creek bed, took on a haunted feel. Ranch hands refused to ride out there alone anymore. They spoke in hushed tones about the buzzards that circled over that patch, even when there was no visible carcass, or about the distant sound of horseshoes at night when no one was out riding. Margaret dismissed their talk as superstition, but deep down, a part of her wondered. Inside the sheriff's office, dusty file folders were beginning to stack on top of Henry's case. The initial flurry of activity, interviews with neighbors, aerial scans, dog tracks, had all come up empty. The horseshoe prints found at the scene were inconclusive. There had been no sign of a struggle, no evidence of foul play, no blood, no broken equipment. Just Henry's hat, a set of faint hoofprints, and the endless, unforgiving expanse of West Texas. Theories sprang up to fill the silence. Some thought Henry had run away. Maybe he'd gotten tired of the grind and slipped away to start a new life. Others said it wasn't like him at all. He loved that ranch. He'd inherited it from his father, who'd inherited it from his own father before him. Henry had poured his entire life into the land. Walking away wasn't just unlikely, it was unthinkable. Still, law enforcement couldn't ignore all possibilities. The detectives interviewed Margaret again and again, trying to uncover anything that might suggest Henry had been planning something. But there was nothing unusual in his bank accounts, no strange phone calls, no cryptic notes. His will hadn't been updated in years. His last grocery purchase had been dog food and flour. Whispers began to stir in town. People talked about an old boundary dispute Henry had with a neighboring landowner, a man named Virgil Brandt. The two had exchanged harsh words more than once over the water rights that both claimed were theirs. Some remembered hearing that things had almost gotten physical between them one evening at the bar in town. But when Brandt was questioned, he denied any involvement and even offered up his own ranch hands to help search. No solid evidence ever linked him to Henry's disappearance. Margaret tried to keep herself busy with the ranch work, but she couldn't do it alone. She hired help when she could, but the finances were tight. She sold off part of the livestock to cover bills and made do with less. Every night she walked out to the porch, sat in Henry's old rocker, and stared out into the desert. Sometimes she imagined him riding home, dusty and tired, apologizing for getting lost. Other nights, she wondered if he was watching her from somewhere, waiting for justice. A year passed, then two. With no new evidence, no sightings, and no communication, Henry Caldwell was quietly labeled a presumed deceased. The paperwork moved forward, but the pain never did. Margaret refused to hold a funeral. Not without a body, she told anyone who asked. He's still out there. The Caldwell case became a local legend. Newcomers to the area were told the story in hushed tones, always ending with the line, "Some say the desert just took him." Hunters and off-roaders occasionally ventured out to the gulch, hoping to find something, anything, that might finally solve the mystery. But the land remained silent, stubborn, untouched. By the end of the fourth year, even the sheriff had all but given up. His team had turned over every lead they could find, dug into every possible motive, questioned every known enemy. Without a witness or a confession, there was nowhere left to go. The desert had covered its tracks too well. Henry Caldwell had become a ghost, not just to his wife, but to an entire town that had once known him well. A man gone without a trace, swallowed by a place vast enough to keep secrets forever. In the spring of 2010, nearly 2 years after Henry Caldwell's disappearance, a quiet buzz moved through the small town of Dry Fork. Someone had bought the Caldwell Ranch. It came as a surprise to most. Margaret hadn't listed it for sale publicly, and many thought she never would. But those close to her knew the burden had become too much. The land had become a constant reminder of everything she had lost. Running the ranch alone was draining her physically, emotionally, and financially. After a long and painful deliberation, she agreed to a private sale brokered quietly through a lawyer from out of town. The new owner, Lyle Simmons, arrived without ceremony. He drove a beat-up gray truck and wore dark sunglasses that rarely came off. He was in his late 40s, tall, thin, with a face that didn't give much away. No one had heard of him before. He wasn't from the area, and when folks asked around, no one could figure out who had recommended him or how he even knew the ranch was available. Lyle didn't introduce himself to the neighbors, didn't attend the local diner, and didn't show up at Sunday church like most newcomers did. Instead, he spent most of his time on the property, overseeing work crews he brought in himself, men with out-of-state plates who camped in trailers on the edge of the property and kept to themselves. Within the first month, several changes were made. Large sections of the ranch were fenced off with new barbed wire, even areas that had always remained open range under Henry's stewardship. No trespassing signs were hammered into posts every 100 yards. Margaret, though no longer living on the land, drove by from time to time. Each visit left her unsettled. The house she had shared with Henry was now shuttered, the windows covered from the inside. The barn had a new padlock, and heavy tire marks scarred the once pristine pastures. Huge trenches had been dug near the southern ridge, where the terrain sloped toward the dry gulch. When she asked about it, the lawyer who had handled the sale told her Lyle was building storm runoff channels, but she didn't buy it. There had never been enough rain in Dry Fork to warrant that kind of work. Neighbors speculated quietly. Some thought he was looking for oil. Others believed he was hiding something, or someone. Rumors grew faster than mesquite in the dry season. One rancher claimed he saw an excavator on the property running late into the night. Another said he heard strange metallic noises coming from a closed-off ravine. But without any proof, it all remained talk. No one wanted to confront the man directly. He wasn't threatening, exactly, but something about him felt off. Too controlled, too quiet, too careful. Despite the questions, Lyle filed all his property taxes on time, maintained the ranch structures well enough, and didn't cause direct trouble. The sheriff had no reason to pursue anything official. But among the locals, especially those who had known Henry Caldwell, suspicion settled in like dust on a porch swing. They remembered Henry as a man who rode with honor, who lent a hand when someone's tractor broke down, who fought hard for his land but never dirty. Seeing his ranch turned into a fortress under the management of an outsider left a bitter taste. By the end of that first summer, Lyle had sealed off the entire southern section of the ranch, about 100 acres of rugged desert and brush that bordered the county line. Few had ever ventured out there, but Henry had always considered it part of the heart of his land. Now, access was completely restricted. Satellite photos later showed new structures, small sheds, steel containers, and deep trenchwork that didn't match any known agricultural purpose. But at the time, no one had reason to look that closely. Margaret tried to move on, settling into a modest home in town and volunteering at the local food bank. But she never stopped wondering about what had really happened to her husband. Something in her gut told her the land still held the answer. And the man now living on it, quiet, secretive, with a past no one could confirm, was somehow connected. For 2 more years, the Caldwell Ranch sat in silence, its fences taller, its paths overgrown, its secrets deeper buried. And then, in 2012, on a cool April morning, a jogger on a nearby trail tripped over something buried just beneath the surface of the sand. What she found would unravel everything. It was early morning, just after sunrise, when Maria Lopez set out for her jog along the remote trails that bordered the edge of the desert near Dry Fork. She was staying with her cousin for spring break, a break she desperately needed from her job as a high school history teacher in Houston. Used to urban parks and suburban sidewalks, Maria had never run through land so raw and open, where the horizon stretched endlessly and the wind carried only the sound of her breath and the crunch of her sneakers on gravel. She took a dirt path that wound along the edge of what had once been the Caldwell Ranch. Though much of the land was now fenced off, this portion remained unmarked, at least for now. Maria liked it for its solitude. She often passed a few jackrabbits and, once, the bleached bones of a coyote. But that morning, as the sun burned orange above the hills, she felt something different in the air, still, heavy, watchful. She slowed as she approached a stretch of uneven terrain dotted with low shrubs and half-buried rocks. Then her foot caught on something. She stumbled forward, nearly hitting the ground, but caught herself just in time. Breathing heavily, she turned to see what had nearly taken her down. At first, it looked like a twisted root or an old pipe, just a sliver of rusted metal poking through the dry soil. But as she stepped closer, wiping sweat from her brow, she saw it was a thick iron chain, the kind used to lock up gates or secure heavy equipment. It was partially buried in the sand, but a few inches looped up into the air, the rusted links tangled together. At the end of it, faintly visible beneath the surface, was something square, something metallic. Curiosity prickled at her. She knelt down, brushed away the dust and sand with her hands, and uncovered more of the object. It was a metal chest, thick, weathered, with iron bands and a large, corroded padlock. Time and desert winds had eaten away at its edges, but it was still intact. A wave of unease washed over her. This wasn't the kind of thing you accidentally lost out here. Someone had put it here, hidden it. Her instincts told her to back away. But her training as a teacher, her interest in history and human stories, urged her to look closer. Was it buried treasure? An old ranch toolbox? A relic of someone's past? But then something else registered. The metal had a strange, almost acidic smell to it, like rust and something older, more decayed. The sand beneath the chest was slightly sunken, as if the weight had shifted over time. Her heart began to beat faster. She pulled her phone from her pocket and snapped a few photos, just in case. Then she dialed 911. "This is going to sound strange," she said when the dispatcher answered, "but I think I found something buried, like a locked chest, in the desert, near the Caldwell Ranch property line." Authorities arrived within the hour. Sheriff Dan Mitchell, who had worked the Caldwell case himself years ago, was one of the first on the scene. As soon as he saw the old padlock and the half-buried metal, his stomach dropped. The location was less than a mile from where Henry Caldwell's trail had gone cold. He hadn't been to this exact spot in years. It was remote, difficult to reach, and had never turned up anything during earlier searches. With care, the officers dug out the box. The earth around it was tightly packed, indicating it had been buried for some time. A few officers exchanged uneasy glances. No one said the word, but they all thought it, coffin. When the lock was finally cut, the lid creaked open slowly under the rising sun. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be an old canvas tarp, were human remains, bones, yellowed and cracked with time. Beside them lay a rusted revolver, a weathered leather belt, and a single spurred boot. One of the deputies pulled the belt closer and read the faded letters pressed into the leather, H.C. Henry Caldwell. The scene fell quiet. Maria, standing at the edge of the tape line, felt a chill ripple through her as the sheriff's voice broke the silence. "Get forensics out here." This just became something much bigger. By the time the chest and its contents were transported to the county coroner's office, news had already begun to spread through Dry Fork like wildfire. A body had been found on the old Caldwell Ranch, buried deep in the desert and discovered by sheer chance. It wasn't long before the initials on the belt, H.C., became the center of every conversation in town. For many, there was no doubt who it was. But no one dared speak it out loud until the tests came back. Forensic teams moved quickly. The canvas wrapping the bones was brittle and stained, but the careful folds indicated that someone had taken the time to cover the body, almost ceremonially. The revolver found alongside the remains was an old 6-shot Colt, badly rusted, but the serial number was still visible beneath years of corrosion. It was traced to a local gun shop in Lubbock, sold nearly 25 years ago to a ranch hand who used to work for Henry Caldwell. His name had surfaced briefly during the initial investigation back in 2008, but he had reportedly moved out of state months after Henry vanished and hadn't been heard from since. The skeleton itself was remarkably intact, preserved by the dry desert conditions. Forensic anthropologist Drive. Emery Tran led the team in examining the remains. The preliminary analysis revealed that the man had suffered a single gunshot wound, clean through the back, between the ribs. The bullet had passed through the spine and lodged in the ribcage. It was still there, deformed and weathered, but unmistakable. The shot had been fatal and immediate. 2 days later, DNA test results confirmed what many already suspected. The bones belonged to Henry Caldwell. When Sheriff Dan Mitchell stepped onto Margaret Caldwell's porch to deliver the news, she stood silently for a long moment, eyes fixed on the horizon. Then she nodded once and said, "I knew he never left." Inside the box with the remains, investigators also found a few personal items: an old silver pocketknife with the initials H.C., a ranch ledger torn in half and water damaged beyond recognition, and a cracked horseshoe that had likely come from Henry's gelding, Buck, who had never been found. These were small but intimate remnants of a life long gone. The medical examiner's report ruled the cause of death as homicide. Henry had been shot in the back and buried deliberately. The position of the body, the method of wrapping, and the locked chest suggested that whoever had done it had taken time, not just to hide the crime, but to ensure it stayed hidden. It wasn't the work of someone panicked or impulsive. It was calculated. Detectives reopened the case files, this time with renewed urgency. Old witness statements were pulled, and timelines were rebuilt. The man who had originally purchased the revolver, Tommy Granger, was now officially listed as a person of interest. But there was a complication. Granger had died of liver failure in Arizona 2 years earlier. Still, his connection to both the murder weapon and the Caldwell Ranch reignited suspicion. Attention then shifted to the timeline. The soil samples around the chest told another part of the story. Forensic geologists determined the ground where the box had been buried had been disturbed between late 2009 and early 2010, more than a full year after Henry went missing. This meant that Henry hadn't been buried immediately, or at least not in that location. He might have been moved. And someone had chosen the Caldwell Ranch, of all places, as his final resting spot. The implications were staggering. The chest itself was another mystery. It wasn't a typical ranch container. It had industrial hinges, reinforced corners, and an unusual locking mechanism more in line with storage for valuable goods than for tools or personal effects. Where it came from, and who had access to such an object, became a key focus in the investigation. Sheriff Mitchell met with his team late into the night. All signs pointed back to the ranch, to the land, and to the people who had come and gone in the time since Henry vanished. The discovery that the body had been buried after the ranch changed hands raised uncomfortable questions about the new owner, Lyle Simmons, whose purchase had always felt too convenient and whose presence had always raised quiet suspicions. They now had a body, a cause of death, a weapon, and a window of time. All that was left to uncover was the truth that had been buried with Henry, and who had worked so hard to keep it hidden. The reopening of Henry Caldwell's case reignited a firestorm of speculation, not just in Dry Fork but across the entire county. For years, people had whispered about what might have happened to the rancher, trading rumors over bar counters and coffee shop tables. Now, with Henry's body recovered, those whispers turned into pointed questions. Who killed him? Why was he buried on his own land? And why had it taken more than a year after his disappearance for that burial to happen? Investigators began to comb through evidence with a new sense of urgency. The revolver found in the chest became the immediate focal point. Though rusted, the serial number was legible, and it was traced back to a man named Tommy Granger. Granger had worked briefly for Henry Caldwell in early 2008, just months before the disappearance. He'd been a quiet drifter type, with no family ties and a history of short-term ranch work across Texas and New Mexico. According to old employment logs, Granger left the Caldwell Ranch abruptly 2 weeks before Henry vanished, claiming he had family business to tend to out west. No one had seen him since. The trail led to Arizona, where records showed Granger had died in 2010 from liver failure in a small hospice outside Tucson. With him dead, the chance to interrogate him directly was gone. But detectives reached out to the facility where he passed, and that's where they found their next break. According to hospice staff, Granger had become increasingly paranoid in his final days. One nurse remembered him muttering about a man in the dirt, and land that didn't belong to him. At the time, no one made sense of it. Now, it sounded eerily specific. Investigators then turned their attention to the timeline. The forensic geologists had dated the soil around Henry's body, determining it had been disturbed in late 2009, well over a year after he disappeared. That meant the body had likely been moved. Someone had kept it hidden elsewhere before burying it in that exact location. This wasn't just a murder, it was a carefully staged cover-up, and whoever was responsible had waited until they had access to the land. That realization brought everything back to Lyle Simmons. Lyle had bought the ranch in early 2010, just weeks after the estimated burial window. His purchase had been sudden and quiet, conducted through a third-party legal firm. Simmons himself had no known ties to Dry Fork or to the Caldwell family, at least none that anyone could find. But the timing was impossible to ignore. Not only did he acquire the ranch right after the burial likely occurred, but within weeks of taking ownership, he had fenced off the exact portion of land where Henry's body was found. When questioned during the sale process, Simmons claimed he planned to start a sustainable agriculture project, one that never materialized. Digging deeper, investigators subpoenaed Simmons's financials and communications. What they uncovered raised even more suspicion. In late 2009, Simmons had received 2 unusually large deposits, one from a closed business account tied to a now-defunct ranch supply company based in New Mexico. That company, records showed, had been co-owned by a man named Virgil Brandt, the same former neighbor Henry had feuded with over land and water rights years earlier. While this didn't prove anything outright, it was enough to convince Sheriff Mitchell that there was more to Simmons than anyone had previously realized. In addition, one of the forensic team's most surprising discoveries came from the canvas used to wrap the body. It wasn't ordinary ranch tarp, it had a distinctive green stitching pattern only used by the military and high-end contractors. It took weeks, but they eventually traced it to a limited batch sold to a construction outfit, one that had done contract work in the area during the winter of 2009. On paper, they had worked on a drainage system project for private landowners. One of those landowners, Lyle Simmons. It was becoming increasingly clear that Simmons had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. But the case was still missing one thing: a direct connection to Henry Caldwell. They needed someone who could place Simmons with Henry, or at least with someone who had been involved in the murder. That break would come unexpectedly from a woman hundreds of miles away. But for now, investigators stared at their evidence wall and saw a picture taking shape, one of betrayal, greed, and land that men were willing to kill for. Henry Caldwell hadn't just disappeared. He had been silenced. And someone had spent years making sure he stayed that way. The interrogation room at the county sheriff's office was dim and quiet, the kind of silence that made a man's own breath feel loud. Lyle Simmons sat across from Sheriff Dan Mitchell, his hands folded neatly on the table. He looked calm, too calm, as if he had prepared for this moment long ago. He wore his usual dark sunglasses, though they had been removed when he entered the building. Without them, his eyes were difficult to read, cold, unblinking, and distant. Sheriff Mitchell had spent weeks building a case against Lyle. Too many coincidences had piled up, and the discovery of Henry Caldwell's remains had turned every coincidence into a glaring red flag. Still, this wasn't a confession room. Not yet. It was a conversation, and Mitchell intended to make it count. "We've reopened the Caldwell case," Mitchell began slowly. "You probably heard." Lyle didn't flinch. "I saw something on the news. You bought the Caldwell Ranch in 2010. You remember what people were saying then? Rumors. Gossip. I didn't listen to much of it. You fenced off the exact section where we just found Henry Caldwell's body," Mitchell said, watching closely for a reaction. "You dug there. You brought in heavy equipment. Know what that looks like to me." Lyle leaned back slightly in the chair. "I told your deputy at the time, I was digging drainage ditches. The land needed it." Mitchell dropped a file on the table. It slid toward Lyle and opened just enough for him to see the crime scene photos, Henry's belt, the rusted revolver, the bones curled under canvas. "He was shot in the back," Mitchell said. "Then wrapped up, locked in a chest, and buried like trash. Soil tests say he was buried in late 2009. You bought the land weeks later. Did you know he was under your feet when you signed the papers?" Lyle stared at the photo but said nothing. Mitchell continued, pulling another sheet from the file. "We traced 2 bank transfers to you. They came from an old ranch supply business tied to Virgil Brandt, Henry's former rival." Lyle's jaw tightened just slightly, too slight for most to notice, but Mitchell had been doing this for a long time. That flicker of tension was all the confirmation he needed to keep pressing. "Here's what I think happened," Mitchell said, leaning forward. "Brandt wanted Caldwell gone. You were the fixer. You came in after Granger. Maybe you knew him, maybe you didn't, but you made the mess disappear. Then you bought the land to control the scene, to make sure no one ever found what was buried." "That's quite a theory," Lyle said quietly. "You paid a construction crew to bury a box in the desert. You claimed it was trench work. But the records are sloppy, and now one of the workers is talking. He says they dug something strange that winter. Big, deep, and that you stayed to supervise every minute." Lyle didn't reply. His hands were still calmly folded, but a small muscle twitched in his cheek. "Here's what's going to happen," Mitchell said, voice sharpening. "We're going to take this to the DA. You're going to be charged with obstruction, tampering with evidence, maybe more if we can prove your hand was on that revolver. You can either talk to me now, or you can wait for your day in court. But we will get the truth, Lyle." The man across the table didn't move for several long seconds. Then, slowly, he leaned forward. "You want the truth, Sheriff. The truth is people like Caldwell think land makes them kings. Think just because they were born here, they own the dirt under your boots. He had power, influence, And he didn't care who he crushed to keep it. Did you kill him? Mitchell asked. Lyle smiled faintly. I cleaned up someone else's mess. That's all I'll say. That's enough for me, Mitchell said, standing. Lyle Simmons was arrested that evening and charged with conspiracy to commit murder and tampering with a crime scene. The case would go on to rock the region, as more details unfolded. But in that small, quiet room, the wall of silence surrounding Henry Caldwell's murder had finally cracked. Outside the sheriff's office, Margaret stood beside her car, watching as deputies led Lyle into the back of a squad vehicle. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. She had seen enough in his face to confirm what her heart had known all along. Henry hadn't died by accident. He had been buried, deliberately, cruelly, and by men who thought they could bury the truth along with him. But the desert, though vast, had finally given him back. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with townspeople, journalists, and those who had followed Henry Caldwell's story for years. The trial of Lyle Simmons had become the biggest event Dry Fork had seen in decades. Some had come out of loyalty to Henry, others out of curiosity, and a few simply to witness the final chapter of a mystery that had haunted the community since 2008. The air inside was heavy with anticipation, as if the truth itself had been sitting silently in the walls, waiting to finally speak. Lyle Simmons sat at the defense table, flanked by two attorneys in crisp gray suits. He looked smaller now, stripped of his control, his sunglasses, and the quiet power he once wielded from the shadows of the Caldwell Ranch. His expression remained impassive as the prosecution built their case, layer by layer, detail by detail, painting a picture of calculated silence and land-fueled greed. The prosecution presented evidence of the timed land purchase, the financial transactions from Virgil Brandt's defunct company, and the forensic proof that Henry Caldwell had been buried months after his disappearance. They showed maps, satellite images, and testimony from workers who remembered digging the trenches under Simmons' supervision. But without a direct witness to the murder, the case remained circumstantial. The defense leaned heavily on this, arguing that suspicion and coincidence weren't enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Then came the twist. No one saw coming. On the fifth day of testimony, the prosecution called a surprise witness, a woman named Caroline Granger, Tommy Granger's estranged sister. She had lived out of state for years, unaware of her brother's connection to the Caldwell case until a news article about the discovered remains made its way to her phone. Her testimony was hesitant at first, but as she spoke, her voice grew steadier. She recounted how her brother, dying from liver failure in 2010, had called her one night from the hospice. He was scared, emotional, and rambling. He said something terrible had happened in Texas, Caroline told the jury. Said he helped someone cover something up. That they killed a man over land. A rancher. He didn't say Henry's name, but he said it was on a ranch with a creekbed and old cattle fences. That matches what you folks know. More importantly, she revealed that Tommy had once mentioned the man who orchestrated everything. He said the guy's name was Simmons. Said he was the one who planned it, paid for it, and made it all disappear. The courtroom held its breath. The defense objected, calling the testimony hearsay, but the damage was done. The jury had heard it, a voice from the grave, delivered through blood. It wasn't a confession in the legal sense, but it was enough to tip the scale. Combined with the forensic evidence, the financial records, and Lyle's own evasive statements under interrogation, the story now had weight, and a name attached to its darkest deed. When the jury returned after 2 days of deliberation, they found Lyle Simmons guilty on multiple counts, including conspiracy to commit murder, unlawful disposal of human remains, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the judge read the sentence, Lyle remained stone-faced, staring straight ahead, never looking toward the crowd, the jury, or Margaret Caldwell. Outside the courthouse, the wind picked up across the plains. Margaret stood quietly as reporters swarmed around her, microphones thrust into her face. She didn't speak at first. Then, finally, in a voice steady with grief and grace, she said, "Henry can rest now. That's all I ever wanted." She returned to the ranch just once after the trial. She stood near the gulch where they had found the chest and ran her fingers along the new wooden cross staked into the earth, carved simply with his initials, H.C. There were no flowers, no ceremony. Just silence, and wind, and the vast desert stretching in every direction. The town of Dry Fork began to heal, slowly. People still told the story, but now it had an ending. The land that had hidden the truth for so long had finally spoken, and the man who tried to silence it had been held accountable. Henry Caldwell was no longer a ghost. He was a man remembered, a man mourned, and finally, a man at peace.